All right, so welcome. As you all know, today is Robertson's Day. We had an incredible day of activities yesterday. And the first thing I'd like to do is really welcome Dr. Dave King, with whom I did my fellowship way back when down in Miami, and have remained good friends since that time.
That was approximately 150 years ago.
Yeah, and we haven't changed.
True enough.
I'll give a formal introduction to Dave in about 7 minutes, but what I wanted to start with was, first of all, the research day component that we had yesterday, and hand out the awards, and then we'll go on to the Trauma Award of Merit. We had a phenomenal group of 10, 11 abstracts yesterday presented, and I think it reflects extremely highly of the resident work and the mentorship that's provided by the different attendings that participate in research activities here at the Montreal General Hospital. And it really speaks so highly of the institution as a whole in terms of being at the forefront of clinical and scientific and public health work that gets done in this institution, province, country. And I'll tell you, it was not easy to decide in terms of awards of who would get them. All the work was absolutely fantastic, work that was based from here all the way to Ukraine and Senegal. So the awards go to, and there are prizes that will be sent out. Giovanna will send those out. For the third place, it's $100. Second place, $200. And am I reversing it? Yes, third place, $100, second place, $200, and first place, $300. And the third place goes to Natasha Kaminsky for her work on the feasibility of intraoperative angioembolization for trauma patients using C-arm digital subtraction angiography. So congratulations. We're all going to clap virtually like this. Congratulations, Natasha. The second place goes to Antoine Denis and Julien Montreux for their work on time to incision and episode of care costs of hip fractures at a Canadian Level 1 trauma center, a value-based healthcare approach. So congratulations, Antoine Denis and Julien Montreux, as supervised by Dr. Mitch Bernstein. And by the way, Natasha was supervised by Dr. Jeremy Grushka. And the first place goes to Dr. Jenny Moon for her work on predictors of clinical deterioration and ICU admission in trauma patients transferred from Northern Quebec to a Level 1 trauma center, a retrospective cohort study. And Jenny is supervised by Dr. Evan Wong. So congratulations. That was all phenomenal work. And then we have, of course, a special mention because the work was quite impressive. And Dr. King was mentioning yesterday how he really thought it was important to highlight this work because he actually never had seen a telemedicine communication for the performance of a fasciotomy. And so this work was presented by Patrick Park, telemedicine guided forearm emergency decompressive fasciotomy for compartment syndrome. And that was supervised by Paul Martineau. And really it reflects back on Jenny Moon's talk in terms of some of the challenges that we have in Canada and the Great North. So congratulations, Patrick, and the rest of the awardees, and the checks are in the mail. All right. In addition, we have the David S. Mulder, Trauma Center, Trauma Program Merit Awards. And this year, each year, we take the opportunity to recognize an individual or a group of people who have made a significant contribution towards the care of trauma patients by presenting them with a Trauma Program Award of Merit. This year, we would like to present this award to all of you, the group of nurse educators who take the time and energy to provide the highly qualified trauma education and training. We, the Trauma Program, recognize your dedication and efforts towards improving clinical care through teaching and training, and we would like to thank each and every one of you for your dedication, support, and energy taken towards always ensuring ongoing and quality of our continued education. And one thing that I have to say is that especially in the last year, and the Award of Merit last year, as you know, Robertson Day was canceled, and all of this, obviously, we had to delay. What was impressive to me by this this group of nurse educators is how each and every one of you stepped up to the plate during COVID. Trauma or not, everybody participated, and it doesn't matter if it was 2 a.m. to train overnight teams during the day, simulation, making sure that the protocols for COVID are well understood. This was tireless work, and it was absolutely a pleasure to be able to have you and work with you, and an honor. And again, this was at the most stressful of times, and I think that stepping up to the plate is just credit to all of you and the institution in which we work. So thank you very much for this. And the award, which, by the way, you will all get these beautiful plaques, goes to, drum roll, Jeremy, Lisa Frick, José Rocke, Linda Baudouin, Nancy Branco, Nancy Tse, Marie-André Jacques, Kathy Becker, Kevin Savage, Eric Turgeon, and Melissa Donaldson. So again, thank you all so much. It's an incredible honor to work with you, and we look forward to working together in the future. Without further ado, we will continue with the day's events. And Nadia, there we go. If everybody could make sure that they're muted, that would be absolutely fantastic. So as you all know, we are here today, not only because it is Grand Rounds, our weekly Grand Rounds, but because of Dr. Rocke Robertson. And Dr. Rocke Robertson actually was born in BC in 1912 and obtained his medical degree from McGill University in 1936. He did his postgraduate surgical training was with another giant who we celebrate later in the year, and that is Dr. Fraser Gird. And Rocke Robertson really played an incredible role in the care of the wounded, which, as Tarek was mentioning earlier on today and has mentioned before, these are the patients in general that are not as welcome in the hospital, but should be the VIPs. He served in the Canadian Army in the medical service between 1940 and 1945 at the rank of lieutenant colonel. His interest was in surgical infections and data collection systems, which continue to be some of the pillars of surgical care and trauma systems, upon which trauma systems were built by other giants such as Dr. Mulder, who really is one of the those that truly spearheaded the development of the trauma system over his career here. And we know, especially in the 80s and 90s, to the outcomes that we have today. Dr. Robertson returned to the Montreal General Hospital in 1959 as surgeon-in-chief, and was professor and chair of the Department of Surgery. In 1962, he was appointed principal and vice chancellor of McGill University. So really having incredible roles and leadership, not only in the surgical world, but also in the broader academic world. The visiting professorship was established in 1996. So we are now 26 years into the visiting professorship and have had illustrious surgeons join this lectureship. It was inaugurated in recognition of Dr. Robertson's incredible achievements at the Montreal General Hospital, the Department of Surgery, and McGill University. So again, I think we need to reflect upon the giants, and I'm sure Dave will speak about those, and really see how we owe them such an incredible debt of gratitude for the work that we continue to do here and globally at the various trauma institutions in which we work. So thank you, Dr. Robertson. Now I'm going to continue with the presentation on Dr. King. And I'd like to first of all thank Dr. Tarek Razak, who is the chief of trauma at the McGill University Health Center, for bestowing this responsibility upon me of running the Rocke Robertson Day. So thank you very much, Dr. Razak. And I'd also like to thank Giovanna Agosino for all of her help, and Tara for all of her help. And I'd also like to thank, of course, Dr. Mulder for mentoring all of us as we develop our careers in surgery, and more importantly in trauma surgery. And of course, Dr. Leanne Feldman, who's the department chair of surgery at McGill University. Moving on to Dr. King. So Dr. King is associate professor at the Harvard Medical School, and is attending surgeon at the other MGH, or man's greatest hospital, except that this one is just south of the border at the Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. Dr. King has an incredible academic and professional career, and is currently colonel in the United States Army, for where he has served for 19 years of service, and has had numerous deployments all over the world. He is also currently attached to the Joint Special Operations Command. He has an interest in pre-hospital bleeding control, intracavitary hemorrhage, non-invasive monitoring for trauma, trauma triage, and human athletic performance. He has multiple inventions and patents on medical devices, and has 250 peer-reviewed publications. Now, Dr. King is my age, so yes, that is quite an academic career. And I think, you know, if you reflect upon his incredible academic and professional achievements, in fact, what stands out more than anything to me about Dave is his endless dedication to surgery, his patients, and the community. Dave works tirelessly to advocate for this community. And in fact, he was one of the primary drivers of the Stop the Bleed course advocating for public health access to hemorrhage control. And this is work he's done since 2011. Some of you attended the talk yesterday, an incredible talk about some of the guiding principles of trauma management. But I think what really stood out most is how his passion for surgery was truly palpable. And I can tell you that most importantly, it doesn't matter where you are, at what time of the day, what time of the night, Dave will always have your back. And you can always count on Dave. And I think that, you know, when you look at the work that he's done academically, but most importantly, his clinical work, you can tell that he's someone that's in there. In fact, he just came back from intubating someone in the intensive care unit. So this work really gives him the credibility that he has. On his free time, David usually puts his feet on the table, has a coffee and a beer. No, actually, no. Dave never sits still. He has an incredible family, and when not with them, he is usually running a marathon or completing a triathlon. He's which we're going to hear about. He's done endless triathlons, and in fact, the most recent, because of COVID, was done remotely, where he ran about, I think you mentioned 365 laps, Dave, around the Bedford School track in Boston. So it takes a lot to run around the track like that, so many times. So without further ado, I'm really excited. We've been excited about this talk for over a year now. I hand it over to you, Dave, to share your experience about the Boston bombing. So thank you very much, Dave.
Thank you, Dan. Very, very kind. Let me see if I can share my screen. Let's see. Are you guys tracking on that?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, very good. And audio check is good? You can hear me?
Super.
Excellent. All right. So I'm going to talk about the Boston Marathon bombing in 2013. And unless you've heard this talk before, it probably comes with a little bit of a different slant, and you'll see why. For a brief period of time, I was probably the most hated surgeon in Boston because I was the only one criticizing our response. And I'll dig into some details there. There really aren't 26.2 lessons, but there's probably about 6 or 7. But it makes for a better title if you use the distance of a marathon in a talk like this. So I'm not going to bore you with 26 lessons. And then just a word about the trial. You may or may not know, I testified in the Tsarnaev trial, and my testimony was key in meeting the statutory requirements for the federal death penalty. The ethics of that aside, whether you believe in the capital punishment or not, it has nothing to do with these comments, except to say that all death penalty cases in America undergo a mandatory appeal, and that is happening right now. Therefore, at the end, you can ask me anything you want about the Tsarnaev trial, but I'm not going to answer. So this talk is about the events that transpired on Patriots Day in 2013 at the Boston Marathon, and I'll say my experience. This is essentially a firsthand account, but it comes through a filter, and that filter for me was built over the course of many combat deployments. You'll note the date of this event. It was September 11th, 2011, which was the 10th anniversary of 9/11. So I was in Logar province in Afghanistan when the largest improvised explosive device ever created by human hands was detonated outside our forward operating base. It was a 9,000 kilogram IED, which was essentially a giant truck bomb. And of course, news in America tends to be America centric. So the headline was 77 Americans wounded, but what was missing from the headline was the nearly 200 Afghan fighters who are our allies who were also wounded. And the reason I mention that is because over the years, I've been involved in many mass casualty events in
I'm going slow, Charlotte.
in a variety of capacities. But this event was unique because I was the only surgeon managing all of these patients by myself. And it was actually this event, this bombing in 2011, that prompted me to start writing my rules of engagement that I went over yesterday. So you can call this filter jaded, you can call it educated. I don't know what to call it, but my view of the Boston bombing is clearly filtered through my experience in Afghanistan. And again, this is we had a little laptop where we could log in all the chest X-rays at our forward operating base. And what I'll just point out was in the middle of the chaos, I took this photo with my phone, and this was casualty number 42. Again, I was the only surgeon there, and as the numbers started to add up, I kept contemplating to myself, and going over the rules in my own head about retriaging, and should number 42 be the 11th to the operating room, or should he be the first, or should he be the 42nd, and so on and so on. And this event led me to question the way we think about triage and how aggressively we should be evaluating trauma patients. So the Boston Marathon in 2013, it was the 117th running. If you don't know, a marathon is 26.2 miles. And funny thing about that is not the original marathon distance that Philippides ran. We think the original distance was probably about 20 miles. And the distance was changed to 26.2 miles during the London Olympics in the mid 20th century, because the Queen wanted the finish line to be near her viewing booth. And so the marathon distance was extended to accommodate that request of the Queen, giving us the current historical distance of 26.2 miles. In 2013, there were almost 27,000 runners, but the race brings out about 500,000 spectators to Boston, and it always coincides with a doubleheader Red Sox game, which means when the game is done, all the fans spill out of Fenway and surround the marathon course, making for a truly remarkable experience. Now, the Boston Marathon is unique. It's the oldest continuously running marathon in the world, but it's a point-to-point race with a negative elevation change. Now, that doesn't make it easy. For any of you that know, yes, the race starts higher than it ends, so there is elevation loss, but the course is considered one of the most challenging in the world because there are 3 hills around the 20-mile mark that really take their toll on you. The most famous of which is so-called Heartbreak Hill, which is appropriately named, I can tell you. This year will be my 11th running of the Boston Marathon, 11 consecutive years. And every year my heart is broken on Heartbreak Hill, because for around mile 19, you think to yourself, gee, I'm doing pretty well here. I'm pretty strong. And then after the hills and mile 20, your soul is just crushed. So what that means is you cannot set a world record on the Boston Marathon course, even though it is, of course, one of the most famous marathons in the world. Let me see. There we go. So this was my race number that year, and back in this day, I used to be on Facebook, and so I race a lot. You know, I've run over 60 marathons.
Dave, you're accidentally muted.
Yeah, there we go. Okay. So back in these days, I was on Facebook, and I've run a lot of marathons. I used to, you know, photograph my bib number so my family could follow me and so on. This is laying out my race gear the night before. I have to say, when I was building these slides, never did I think I'd be using a photo like this in a presentation. This is about 27 hours, but before the bombs went off. Let's see. This is the start line in Hopkinton. Hopkinton is a pretty sleepy little town. Of course, 26 miles away from downtown Boston, where the finish line is. And Hopkinton was never meant to accommodate, 25,000 or 30,000 runners. And so what you see here happening is on race morning, buses pick all the runners up in the Boston Common and bus them out to Hopkinton, where the runners lollygag around this high school, everyone doing the same move. That is trying to stay hydrated for the start, but carefully calculating their hydration and timing with porta potty availability, because everyone wants to start the race fully hydrated, but with an empty bladder. And that can actually be quite a challenge, especially if you misjudge it a little bit and you wait till the last minute and you realize you have to urinate, but the start is in 2 minutes, and you don't want to start with the discomfort of having a full bladder. And anyway, so that is the delicate dance that all these 30,000 people are doing in Hopkinton before the start. So this is me on Marathon Monday on Patriots Day, about an hour and a half before the bombing. And then this is at the finish line. And what happened to me was back in these days, you could what we call check a bag. That is, you could run out or bus out to the start line with a bag with snacks and hydration and an extra sweater, whatever you're wearing. And the buses, after the marathon started, would bring your gear back to the finish line. So when you got there, you could retrieve your gear bag and put on dry clothes or have a snack or whatever. And what happened to me was I finished the race about an hour before the bombs went off, went to retrieve my gear bag, stood in the wrong line for the wrong bus, which meant that I had to go find the right line, which meant that I was in the athlete recovery area for an extraordinary amount of time, much longer than I would normally be, which is why I was around when the bombs went off. And what happened to me was that I retrieved my bag finally, and as I was getting in a taxi to go home, I heard something, or I didn't really hear something. I felt something in my feet that almost felt like an earthquake. But I didn't know what that was. And it's downtown Boston. And there are several giant high rises between me and where the bombs detonated. So I think that muffled the sound. So I didn't hear anything. I just felt something in my feet. And I thought to myself, gee, that's odd. And then as I got in the taxi, I turned my phone on, and my phone started filling up with text messages from friends. And, the first couple dozen were the usual things from friends saying, hey, tracked you online, strong run, good work. And then my really close friends were texting me like, hey, loser, why are you so slow? Tracked you online. Maybe you can run faster next time. You're such a punk. And then I started getting odd text messages like, hey, heard something went wrong. Are you okay? And I didn't know what any of that meant. And as we were driving away, I got close to home, and I don't know why. I tried accessing some news sites. I tried using the browser on my phone to go to CNN or Boston.com and so on. But none of those URLs would load, and I kept pressing reload. And the whole thing just seemed odd to me. And that's because, of course, the bombing immediately saturated the cellular network in Boston. And then all the cellular networks got shut down for a period of time because the FBI was worried that there were going to be additional devices that would be cellularly detonated. So they shut down all the cellular networks. So for reasons that's I still cannot really clearly articulate, I got out of the cab and ran over to the hospital and used a back entrance and ran up to the call room where I grabbed my surgical cap and iPro before I went down to the emergency department. And I still can't explain that. All I can say is I just had this gut bad feeling, and why I would go grab iPro and a surgical cap first, I don't know, but I just had this awful feeling that something like that had happened, but I really had no idea. And when I showed up in the ED, I used this back stairwell, and I kicked open the door. I could see across all of the trauma bays, and all the curtains were open in uncharacteristic fashion, offering essentially no privacy. But I could see 5 or 6 of the patients in the first wave, and they all had this, fairly characteristic bilateral lower extremity blast injury that I had recognized as a pattern I'd seen thousands of times in Afghanistan. And that's when I knew the game was up, and I knew something had happened. So this is a very interesting photo that tells mostly the whole story. And I'll just point out some highlights here. The pressure cooker bomb is right here in yellow. This is Martin Richard, who is 9 years old. He died almost instantaneously in the blast. This is Dokar Sarnayev right here. This is Crystal Campbell. She's important because she's the first patient that I operated on. This person right here is Caitlin Cates. She's important because she's the index patient for the Boston bombing. So the first patient to show up at any hospital anywhere with bombing related injuries. And she later became quite a good friend. And the reason she was the index patient is because standing behind her here is, I'll tell you a little story. I'll get back to this story. It's kind of funny, and you have to find humor where you can among such awful events. But the reason she was the index patient is because she was attending the marathon with a friend who was a boy, and not her boyfriend, as I later found out. And when she got injured in the blast, he was parked illegally around the corner, just up on the curb, and he just picked her up and drove her to Mass General and dropped her off in the ED. Similar to what I talked about yesterday, the Homey Medical Service. And probably one of the reasons she survived is because she had a devastating limb injury with exsanguination. And she probably survived because she had a very, very fast evacuation time, thanks to this boy who was a friend who was attending the marathon with her. The other thing I'll say about this photo is this case of this relatively famous, awful case of mistaken identity. So as it turns out, Roseanne Sedoya here and Crystal Campbell here are good friends. And for some reason, I don't know why, Crystal Campbell asked Roseanne to hold her purse a few moments before the blast. Now, I don't think ever in my life I've asked another man to hold my wallet, but I'm told that this is a thing that women do sometimes, ask other women to hold their purse. Well, what that resulted in was an awful case of mistaken identity. Roseanne was injured in the blast, and Crystal Campbell was killed on the scene. Roseanne came to me severely injured, and the state police searched her and, of course, found a purse. And in that purse was an ID that said Crystal Campbell. And as it turns out, you can see they're both about 5'6". They both have blonde hair. They both have blue eyes. They're both about 135 pounds. So everyone thought that Roseanne was really Crystal Campbell. So we called Crystal Campbell's family to the hospital. And when I got out of surgery, I went down and talked to them, and I said, you know, your daughter has sustained these awful injuries, but she's alive, and you know, her road to recovery will be rocky, and we're not out of the woods yet, and she has some blast lung and so on. And I brought them up to the ICU to be with her, and of course, the family walked in and said, "That's not our daughter." And of course, by process of elimination, if we thought that was Crystal Campbell in the hospital, it meant that the other blonde who was dead on the scene was Roseanne Sedoya. And so the state police had gone to Roseanne's family's house and said, "We're very sorry, but your daughter's dead." Now we had to go back, find Roseanne's family, and tell her family, "Oh, by the way, your daughter's alive and just got out of surgery." And very sadly, we had to tell Crystal Campbell's family, "We apologize for the case of mistaken identity, but your daughter passed away on the scene." It was awful for everyone involved. It was a terrible, honest mistake, but just highlights that the confusion and the fog that can cloud management of mass casualty incidents. So none of these pictures I show you are privileged. They used to be, but after the trial ended, they all got released to the Associated Press. So everything is for public consumption. These are a few pictures of the bombing, and you can just see the massive blood loss on the scene and the chaos. What's interesting here is that the Tsarnaev brothers wanted to. They very clearly stated they wanted to kill American marathoners, and of course, as you probably know, no runners were actually injured in the blast. It was only spectators. Very sad. And it took about 7 minutes for anyone to realize what was happening, and for the police to stop the race. So for about 6.5 minutes, runners kept running by the blast and by the mayhem and the chaos, of course not understanding what was happening. And even the race management and the police didn't understand what was happening, which is why it took so long to close the race course, which is why there are so many photos circulating around of literally hundreds of runners passing by all the patients with the massive on-scene blood loss. So this is a graphic of the two explosions on Boylston Street and where they relate to the finish line. So I was just off the screen at the bottom when I felt the rumble in my feet. These two blasts are probably they're only a block and a half apart, which probably represents about 80 meters or so, 90 meters. This is the EMS staging area, and the Boston Marathon the event is so large. The medical response, not to the bombing, but just taking care of the marathoners and the spectators, is a multi-agency undertaking every year. And the marathon brings with it a ton of medical problems, not just problems for the marathoners, heat-related injuries, exertion-related injuries, but invariably every year there are a handful of marathoners who just got their brand new LAD stents on aspirin and Plavix and Coumadin and everything else, who decide they're going to run, who get crushing chest pain, at mile 19 in the hills or something. So the medical response at the Boston Marathon is always robust and is always multi-institutional and multi-departmental. And that multi-departmental response, of course, was tested in 2013 in a way that it had never been before. When we look at all the injured, these are just the patient transports by EMS, which does not account for patient transports by family members and patients who self reported to the ED, that is, drove themselves. And what is misleading is if you look at these numbers, you say, well, that doesn't add up to 243 patients, which is the number of people injured in the bombing. But that's because many of these transports had more than one patient. That is, in some cases, there were 3 or 4 patients in a single ambulance in order to evacuate them from the scene. And if you look at some of these numbers, 100% of critical transports were at the hospital in 60 minutes. So that is actually fairly dismal. And again, for a while, I was one of the least favorite people in Boston because I was the only person looking at the data and trying to figure out what we did right, what we did wrong, and where we could improve. And taking an hour to get critical patients triaged as critical, that is orange or red, to the hospital is completely unacceptable. So this is our first wave of patients at MGH. Had to block out some times to accommodate HIPAA because you can look up in the news who arrived when, and so we have to protect that. But the first patient arriving at 3:04 was Caitlin Cates. And by the way, the names that I'm using in the presentation and some of the photos I use with direct permission from the patients who are okay with me using their names and talking about them. So Caitlin Cates arrived at 3:04, and you can see she was coded as an amputation, which she did not have. And if you look down, as all these patients started arriving, you'll note that they very quickly went from having specific injuries like knee injury, left hand injury, and amputation, shrapnel foot, to more generic coding such as explosion, trauma, disaster. And that is because the electronic medical record system was bogging down the initial registration of all these patients in the ED. And if your system is anything like ours, you can't get a unit of blood, or you can't get a dose of Tylenol without a wristband and a medical record number in order to code that patient or log that patient in, let alone book them for surgery. And so one of the problems we quickly recognized was that in these mass casualty situations, you have to dismiss with trying to sort of carefully code people's injuries and just log them in as trauma or disaster or something generic like explosion. Additionally, we quickly realized that we were experiencing a mass casualty incident and activated a mass casualty plan. So the red arrow here is Caitlin Cates, who did not have an amputation, but did have a devastating limb injury. But what you'll note here, the blue arrows, what you'll note here with the blue arrows are patients who were discharged. And of course, this is a problem because what this means, it means discharge from the ED. And what that means is they were triaged on the scene as critical, re-triaged in our ambulance bay as critical, and then found to have non-critical injuries that could be discharged directly from the ED. So this is an awful triage problem, right? And when we did a deep dive on this, what we learned is that these so-called critical patients were covered in blood from nose to knees. And that made them look very scary, like they were very injured. But what we quickly found out is that, yes, they were covered in blood from nose to knees, but it wasn't their blood, right? It was the bystanders' blood that was on them. And in the chaos of this, they got triaged as critical, like, holy cow, you're covered in blood, you should go into the ED. And what that meant was, in this first wave, we mistriaged 5 patients, and those are 5 patients who consumed resources in the ED that probably should have been directed to 5 other patients. So again, as the sole critic in Boston, this analysis was not greeted with grins initially, but it is certainly something that we learned from, and now recognize is something we could have done better, and that is better triage. And it gets back to my talk yesterday. You have to know where the holes are, and yes, you have to expose patients to triage them because you have to see their injuries, but then you have to work on preventing hypothermia. This is our emergency department volume, and you'll note that the red line is where we called code disaster, but the bombing actually occurred about an hour and a half before that. So this is the ED volume, and you see it starts creeping up here. And these are patients, these are all marathon patients, but not marathon bombing patients. So they're just the regular patients who show up with marathon-induced colitis or heat-related injuries. They're just regular patients accumulating in the ED, or they're spectators who are suddenly having an MI or a ruptured AAA, or they're just the people who are at the marathon who developed acute appendicitis and are reporting to the ED. So you can see the volume is increasing and increasing. And about 30 minutes after the bombing, we recognize that we have a mass casualty incident. We activate our disaster plan. And what's interesting here is you can see how effectively we emptied out the ED. And this is at the same time the ED volume is decreasing, but the bombing patients are still arriving. And you see, we start to get behind the curve a little bit. There's this spike where we're moving patients out of the ED, but then bombing patients are starting to accumulate. And we recognize that if we don't correct that pattern, the ED will become overwhelmed. And we make some additional moves to start moving more patients out to accommodate the surge volume. This is one of the things that we did remarkably well. And you might say, well, how did you do that? And that's a whole separate talk on how to manage surge capacity and move patients out of the ED. But one of the things we did was this famous page at MGH, Psychiatry to the ED Stat. And you would say, why would you summon the psychiatrist to deal with bombing patients? And of course, that's not what we did. But there were an unusual number of acute psych patients in the ED that morning. And of course, we needed to clear them out. And as it generally happens at a teaching hospital, when a patient needs to be admitted, the medical student on the service sees that patient, who talks to the intern, who talks to the junior resident, who talks to the senior, who talks to the fellow, who might call the attending to get permission to admit the patient and understand what the management might be. And what we decided to do was to cut out all the middle people. So we had the psych attendings and the faculty of services come down directly and admit patients and write abbreviated orders. So in some cases, the admission of these acute psych patients, the orders might look like, 5 milligrams Haldol, Q2 minutes, PRN until patient looks comfortable, admit to floor, right? It might be just that simple in order to clear them out. And by eliminating all the middle residents on these routine patients, that's one of the many things we did to help exercise our surge capacity and make space for the bombing patients. So this is Roseanne Sadoya's leg. You can see she had a pretty devastating limb injury. But what I'll point out is one of the rules from yesterday, and that's this. So don't get distracted by the obvious. So yes, Roseanne had a devastating limb injury, but that is not what was killing her. What was killing her was abdominal exsanguination. So this is her dressing at the end. You see, she had a laparotomy first. We tourniqueted her limb injury and dealt with that second. So don't get distracted by the obvious. It's very tempting to focus on this and immediately start operating on this leg. Meanwhile, the real business was an iliac artery injury in the abdomen from fragmentation. And you can even see the discoloration in the flanks from her intra-abdominal injuries. So do not get distracted by the obvious. Same as here with this patient. The limb injuries are impressive, but you can see a pneumatic tourniquet on one limb and another popliteal injury, which will humble you, and this one humbled us. But that right limb was effectively tourniqueted while we dealt with her thoracic injuries. You can see her thoracotomy incision is closed, followed by a laparotomy to deal with some blunt solid organ injuries before moving on to the visually impressive limb injuries. So again, do not get distracted by the obvious. Just because a patient has an impressive limb injury doesn't mean they're not exsanguinating in a different body cavity, and you need to deal with the intracavitary hemorrhage first, because the limb injuries, when appropriately tourniqueted, are temporarily forgettable. They're not where you should be focusing or spending your time. So in the first 15 minutes, we had 43 patients with 9 emergent operations, 6 amputations, a couple laparotomies, a thoracotomy, 1 traumatic arrest, and number of in-hospital deaths at MGH was 0, and number of in-hospital deaths across all of Boston was 0. And this is our trauma team assembling several hours after all the index surgery was done. And there's a lesson here. And the lesson, of course, is that it's not time to go home. Once the index surgery is done, that's the time where everyone wants to leave, but it's the moment where you need to press on harder. And the reason I say that is you can see me here. And what we're doing is going over every single patient in detail. And the reason is, right, I may have seen and operated on, 6 or 8 patients in that first handful of hours. So I have detailed knowledge of those 6 or 8 patients because I operated on them. And I have in my mind, amongst those 6 or 8, who is going to have the first take back tomorrow morning, who needs additional imaging, who needs to go to angio. But I have no idea what my partner's patients look like. And this is Eric Klein, our trauma fellow at the time. You can see he's exhausted. But I have no idea what he operated on, and no idea what my other partners in the back operated on. So the point is, you have a little piece of information that has to get shared with everyone on the trauma team. And what I think should be the priority for take back might change dramatically when I understand the condition of the other 38 patients that I don't have knowledge of. So the point of this meeting was to re-triage every single patient who presented to the MGH. So we understood what the ICU bed needs were, who needed to go back when, what body cavities were left open, and how we were going to sequence all of these takebacks. So the point here is, just when you think it's time to go home, it's not. That's the time to get everyone together, re-triage, and get back on the same page. And one of the other lessons we learned here was this is some of our resident team here. And I looked across at them and I said, how many patients had ruptured tympanic membranes? And their response to me was well, we think one. And I said, impossible. How many patients TMs did you look at? And they said, well, probably just the one. And that's appropriate because patients are exsanguinating, and that's probably not the time to get the otoscope out and look at their tympanic membranes. But what it does mean is that many of these patients were incompletely evaluated, appropriately so. The patient with limb exsanguination or abdominal exsanguination does not need their TMs looked at acutely, or they do not need their anatomical snuff box examined acutely, but they do need it examined. And so one of the other takeaways from this meeting was that no one could go home until we went back and re-triaged every patient and looked at all the details, looked at everyone's TMs, did appropriate tertiary surveys to identify all of the small injuries that mattered a lot, right? So you might say, well, the ruptured TM is not going to kill anyone. But 6 months later, when they have dramatic hearing loss because their ruptured TM went unrecognized and untreated for half a year, probably that is significant morbidity that could have and should be prevented. And the same is true for, the missed talus fracture, or, the missed metacarpal fracture, because no one was paying attention to that stuff initially. So we went back and re-triaged every single patient with very careful tertiary surveys to identify all these little tiny missed injuries that matter. So just when you think it's time to go home, it's not. So these are blood products that we use on our patients in the first 12 hours. You can see the ratio is reasonable, but not great. 18 operations in the first 12 hours, 131 units of blood products, and kind of a unideal ratio. And when I retrieved these numbers from our blood banker, Sonny Zeke, I said, Sonny, we're working our tails off. How was it for you guys in the blood bank, trying to provide these products for us on demand? And he kind of laughed and he said, David, we weren't working that hard. It might look like a lot, but this is like a regular Monday morning with a liver transplant that's gone bad. He's like, so yes, it's a lot of blood products, but for us, this was like a regular work day. So the system may have been stressed in some ways, but we had such a magnificent blood bank and blood bank personnel that what we thought would have been a limiting factor for us was not. But the takeaway here is that we were very fortunate, and not all hospitals would have had such a magnificent blood bank. And in the absence of a well-functioning blood bank, the outcome could have been very, very different for our patients. And so what I would say the lesson here is, if you're not best friends with your blood bankers, you probably need to be when it comes to disaster planning, because you can't do it without them. And that's a lesson that goes for many of the other allies we have in mass casualty incidents, like respiratory therapy, critical care nursing, and so on. And one of another lesson we learned from our blood bank experience is that we had some delays in getting red cells and FFP, and now we have a low O warmed whole blood program, and a thawed plasma and thawed RBC program, such that it's much easier to have immediate availability of blood products should such a thing happen again, and for the routine trauma patients who just need a lot of blood. And then a variety of things happened. About 91 hours after the bombing, this happened. So you may know I've been the regional presidential surgeon for many years, serving many U.S. presidents. So I coordinate the presidential care whenever they're in town. Martha's Vineyard seems to be a fairly favorite vacation spots of many U.S. presidents. So I help coordinate their care and care of the first family as well. And I had never met Rocke before this, but he knew about me and he knew I was his regional surgeon. And when he came to Boston to meet some of the bombing patients, this was on Thursday, so that's Tuesday, Wednesday, 3 days after the bombing. In the elevator ride up to the ICU, right before this photo was taken, he said, Dr. King, it's great to meet you. I understand, you've been coordinating my care when I'm in the area for years. And he was kind of a funny guy. And he said, it's a pleasure to meet you, but I'm glad I'm meeting you in the vertical position instead of the horizontal position. And I'll tell you another little funny story. When I was introducing him to Caitlin Cates, our index patient, Caitlin was accompanied by her friend who was a boy who brought her to the hospital that likely saved her. And when the president and I were talking to Caitlin, her friend who was a boy decided this was the appropriate time to propose marriage. So he did in front of us. And Caitlin did not immediately say yes. And there was this very long, awkward pause. And Barack leaned over to me and he's like, Dr. King, what do we do? This is really awkward. And of course, Caitlin did not marry that boy. But it made for an extremely awkward moment for a hot minute when emotions were clearly misunderstood by those two. And that's Deval Patrick, the governor, in the background. And the rest of the crowd is the Secret Service bubble. And you might see there's a guy in the back here carrying a big bag. That's the nuclear football that always travels with the president. It's pretty neat to be in the bubble for a few hours. And then the following day, the so-called longest day in Boston with the manhunt for the Tsarnaev brothers and the shelter-in-place order, which was unprecedented, the first time that's happened in Boston in over 150 years. And that event, of course, led to the loss of Officer Sean Collier, who was shot by the Tsarnaev brothers, and then the story of Richard Donahue, who was also shot, as it turns out, in a fratricide incident, so a friendly fire incident in the shootout to try to capture the Tsarnaev brothers. Richard was shot in the groin, so he had a high femoral artery injury just underneath the inguinal ligament with massive scenic sanguination. And I'll tell the story of Richard Donahue to make a point here. So he was transported to a non-trauma center just outside of Boston called the Mount Auburn Hospital in near arrest. And a team there, led by a senior resident, frankly, took him to the operating room and explored his groin, got control, sewed in a piece of graft, and Richard ended up surviving because of that. And the reason I tell that story is to remind us all that you can do a lot with a little. Now, if that hospital had 10 patients like Dick Donahue, probably 9 of them would have died. But they didn't have 10, they had 1. And for a non-trauma center with a blood bank that is sleepy at best and an operating room woefully unprepared to manage complex trauma patients, they saved him. So it's just a reminder to us all that you can do a lot with a little. You don't have to come to the mecca of a trauma center to affect an amazing outcome for a patient. So, I often tell my daughters, and I tell people that I runners that I coach marathoning and endurance racing, that just when you think you have nothing left to give, there's always something left in the tank. It's even made it onto some magnets in our house. That applies to managing trauma patients as well. Just when you think that this patient can't survive, we don't have the right resources, I would compel you to remember the story of Dick Donahue. You can figure out a way. You can often always figure out a way. It might not be optimal. It might be the lesson I was mentioning yesterday that no, crystalloid is sweet intravenous poison. But when the blood pressure is 30 and that's all you have, that might be the thing that saves the patient. So just remember the story of Dick Donahue and where he went with a terrible injury. You can do a lot with a little. And the only thing I'll say about this was that these two characters, despite what they did to the city of Boston, received the same exceptional medical care that all the bombing victims did. And that says something about where our hearts lie in Boston. So the total toll, 4 killed, 261 injured, 5 killed if you include Sean Collier. Over 66 limb injuries, 17 traumatic amputations, and no hospital deaths. And so in Boston, when things go well, we like to glad hand and pat ourselves in the back and think of ourselves as so great. And if you read the newspapers, they very early on started reporting the lessons from the Boston bombing and how it turned out so well and how nobody died if you got to the hospital. And these were the so-called lessons that they have. They said it was race day. What does that mean? It means that there was medical infrastructure on the scene. That is, there was a giant medical tent at the finish line. Now, that medical tent was set up to manage heat casualties and sprained ankles, not trauma patients. They'll say it was a city holiday. What does that mean? It means that in Boston, it was Patriots Day, which meant that the average evacuation time on a regular workday from Boylston Street to MGH was about 20 minutes in traffic. But on Patriots Day, on the day of the bombing, it was a holiday, so there was no traffic. So the average transport time was about 7 minutes. So that contributed maybe to improve survival. But it was hardly a disaster plan. It was 3 p.m. And what that meant was it meant that was shift change for a lot of nursing. And so what it meant was we were suddenly double staffed. We just told the offgoing people stay. And of course, the oncoming people were coming in. And so it meant that we had twice the nursing staff. That was hardly planned that way, right? We didn't plan the bombing for 3 p.m. The devices were relatively low yield, not to take away from the mayhem they created, but had these two characters got a hold of some unexpended 155 artillery rounds and detonated those, the outcome would have been very different. And we say, or they said, it was Boston, which meant that we had 6 level 1 trauma centers within a very dense area. So that's a lot of medical infrastructure. These are hardly lessons, though. And they'll say that the military lessons of war were relatively well disseminated. And I think that's true. That is, at this time, we had been at war in the global war on terror for well over a decade. And we learned a lot about high ratio transfusion, antifibrinolytics, and how to manage mass casualties. And that had been fairly well disseminated in the peer-reviewed literature. But again, that's hardly a disaster plan. And as Paul Harvey would say, I don't know if you know this in Canada, Paul Harvey, and I guess now his son, ran this radio show often called The Rest of the Story, where he would talk about famous historical incidents and try to fill in the backstory. So the story that you might know the main line, but you didn't know the background. And what I would say is this is my rest of the story about lessons learned from the Boston bombing. So number of severe limb injuries, 66. Number of limbs exsanguinating on the scene was 29. Number of pre-hospital tourniquets was 27. So you'll note that there were several severe limb injuries that went untourniqueted. And number of improvised tourniquets was 27. You see a pattern here? So you'd say, well, who cares about that? So I will offer you my real lessons from that data to take home with you. So I call this a failure to translate. So there were no tourniquets or advanced topical hemostatic agents available at the finish line or through any of our EMS agencies. So this is a picture of a casualty I took care of in Afghanistan a few years ago. And you'll note the devastating bilateral lower extremity injuries. You'll also note that he's not bleeding. He has two effectively tourniqueted thighs. And what that meant was that we started operating on this patient in the abdomen first. Again, don't be distracted by the obvious. It could be you could very easily be distracted by these limb injuries, but these effectively tourniqueted limbs were temporarily forgettable, just like some of our Boston bombing patients. But at the scene, there were no purpose-made tourniquets. Boston EMS wasn't carrying them, neither were any of the other agencies. And there were no topical hemostatic agents available, which meant that many of the junctional injuries, like Dick Donahue, went effectively untreated or were treated in a way that could have been better. All of the tourniquets on the scene were improvised. I wrote a manuscript about this that is easy to find on PubMed. Improvised tourniquets do not work. I don't know how many papers have been written about this. Well, I mean, I do know several dozen. It's not that it's impossible to improvise an effective tourniquet. It's that you can do so in the sterility of a classroom, but multiple publications have shown us over and over again, including some from me, that when you try to improvise a tourniquet under duress, that is under stress, and during mass casualty events, invariably you do so poorly. And often those tourniquets are venous tourniquets. And I wrote about this in this paper published a few years ago. And you'll note the date is long before the Boston bombing. I started ringing this bell. That is the dangers of improvised tourniquets and even purpose-made tourniquets that are not tight enough. And as you know, when you apply a tourniquet that's not tight enough, that results in a venous tourniquet, which results in the so-called paradoxical bleeding, right? You can worsen blood loss if you occlude venous outflow, but don't occlude arterial inflow. What that does is guarantee that the entire cardiac output going to that limb will spill out onto the street, resulting in so-called paradoxical hemorrhage and massive exsanguination. And the reason that matters is, I'll tell you another brief story. Roseanne Sadoya had an improvised tourniquet put on her devastating limb injury. And a police officer used his belt to improvise a tourniquet for Roseanne's leg. And he was pulling on this tourniquet during the ride to the hospital. He wouldn't leave her side. So he was pulling on his belt over a single fulcrum, right over the belt buckle, and her bleeding stopped. But the reason her bleeding stopped is because her blood pressure was probably 50 or 40. That's why the limb exsanguination stopped. And when the blood pressure is that low, you don't need very much circumferential pressure on an improvised tourniquet to stop hemorrhage. But of course, what happened on her ride to the hospital is she naturally was auto-transfusing herself, right? She was shifting fluids from her interstitial space to her intravascular space. And she was initially unconscious and became conscious because her blood pressure was rising. She had an appropriate catechol response, and she became aware, and her limbs started bleeding again. And she noted this because she started feeling warm and wet along her back. And when I talked to her after her operation, she was very angry at this police officer and wanted to know who she was, because she wanted to give him a piece of her mind. And why would he loosen up on her tourniquet and let her bleed like that? She was very upset. So I explained to her the dangers and pitfalls of an improvised tourniquet, and that while that was probably not the best scientifically guided decision, no one had purpose-made tourniquets that day. And he was doing his darndest to pull on his belt to stop her from exsanguinating, and probably did in some respects. And once she understood that, she forgave him, tracked him down. They dated, he proposed, and now they're married. So that's an interesting, good story that came out of some bad circumstances. So this was a topic that that again, I've been ringing this bell since 2011, recognizing the pitfalls of putting even purpose-made tourniquets on inappropriately. And what I would also say is that all of our local EMS really had no formal protocol or training in limb exsanguination. And the military did, though, or does. And to me, this is another example of a failure to translate. Now, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. The TC3 committee already has guidelines. All you have to do is get your local EMS to adopt them. And you just just pull the guidelines and change the language from soldier to bystander or, paramedic or whatever. We don't need to reinvent the wheel here. And just as a reminder, the most common error in applying a purpose-made tourniquet is failure to pre-tension. So pre-tensioning is taking all the slack out of the tourniquet before you start twisting the windlass. And it's the most common error, and it's the least appreciated, most important step. And yes, there was a giant medical tent at the finish line, but in general, once you were in the medical tent, there was a stay and play mentality, and these were exsanguinating patients who got a lot of salt water for so-called resuscitation, but no hemorrhage control maneuver. So my criticism was slow to evacuate from the medical tent. Yes, there was medical providers there. None of them were trauma providers. And the medical tent was ill-equipped to deal with exsanguination. They were set up for heat casualties and sprained ankles. And then we had this very obvious failure of technology with our electronic medical record system, as I pointed out, was slow and hard to register patients. And we also recognized the dangers of sequential medical record numbers. So if you came in and were assigned a medical record number 1234, and then I wanted to go look up your blood gas, and I made a single keystroke error and I put in medical record number 1235 by accident, it suddenly meant I was looking at the wrong bombing patient's data because I made a single keystroke error when I looked that patient up. So sequential medical record numbers are dangerous. And if your disaster plan calls for that, you should probably change that. And you'll note that we started going old school on our medical record. This is a picture of my pants, my scrub pants. I just took a Sharpie and started making notes about patients' injuries so I could keep track of them because the electronic medical record system was too slow. And then even our nurse practitioners switched to paper very early on, our trauma nurse practitioners, to try to keep up because we recognize the failure of our electronic medical record system. And then please, I keep ringing this bell, but do not be distracted by the obvious. Most of the patients with limb injuries also had this, right? That is intra-abdominal exsanguination. That's a photo of a positive abdominal fast exam. The business was often in the abdomen, and tourniquet the limbs, forget about them, deal with the intracavitary hemorrhage, and then move on to the extracavitary hemorrhage. And again, this is a reminder that the tertiary trauma survey is critically important in identifying missed injuries, including ruptured TMs, metacarpal fractures, all the small things that matter in the big picture, but might not matter during the initial triage. So it is appropriate to skip examining the tympanic membranes when you're initially triaging these patients. It is inappropriate to not go back and check on all these details once the dust is settled. In the fog of dealing with these patients, some small details can get missed. So this is Mark Foucaril, and I use his name because it's been made public and with his permission. So you can see the fragmentation to his pelvis. So he had some devastating junctional injuries, but what was missed for him was on his chest X-ray. You'll note a pellet, a fragmentation injury over his precordium. So this was initially missed, and once he went to the operating room for his junctional injuries, he was doing physiologically very poorly. And like I mentioned yesterday, when the patient is doing poorly, you have to question that you're missing an injury. So smartly, the team pulled up his chest X-ray and realized that he had fragmentation over his heart. We're preparing to do a pericardial window to exclude pericardial injury from what was initially missed. This was initially thought to be a normal chest X-ray, and instead we threw a TEE probe down and demonstrated that there was nothing wrong with his heart, and he had no holes in his thorax. So we couldn't quite explain where this fragment came from, and until after his operation, we did a proper workup. And can anyone have any idea where I'm going with this? It's pretty remarkable workup. On his echo, we located this fragment in his right atrial free wall on the atrial side of his tricuspid valve. And this thing moved with transesophageal echo. And on an ECG-gated cardiac CT, we could see that it was trapped in the trabeculae of his atrium. So this was a bullet emboli, a fragment emboli from his groin that had flown up his cava and got trapped in his heart. So there was much discussion about whether or not to retrieve this or leave it, risk of infection, endocarditis, and so on. We ended up deciding to leave it alone. And, it's been many years and much follow-up, and this fragment is still in his trabeculae. It's been fully incorporated and has never caused him a problem. So for me, these are my real lessons from the marathon bombing. I'll just remind you that trauma patients don't need oxygen. And if you have a trauma patient who is desaturating on room air, that is someone who needs all of your attention. And they don't need intravenous fluid either. You need to identify patients who are fluid dependent. If they're fluid dependent, they probably need an operation. And yes, triage involves radiology sometimes, but the tunnel of death is not where any of your mass casualty patients belong, certainly not initially. So forget about the CT scan. The best way to triage a patient who you want a CT scan is who you have an urge to CT is to park them in the corner and watch them with your naked eye. They will declare themselves. They have no business going in the tunnel of death, particularly early on. There is a role for this, but it is not in the first hour of a mass casualty event. So that's Roseanne. That's her many liters of blood loss in the OR, and that's her following up in clinic. And she was one of the first bombing patients to get a prosthetic and become fully functional. This is a picture from October 2014, a sad picture. This was Halloween night. I was on call, and yet another improvised tourniquet came in. There are a couple problems with this photo. One is that there's an improvised tourniquet on a limb injury. And two, it's a limb injury that doesn't need a tourniquet. And three, it's a tourniquet applied below the knee, which, as you know, is generally largely ineffective. So tourniquets applied below the elbow or below the knee are almost universally ineffective. Furthermore, injuries below the elbow and below the knee almost never need a tourniquet. Those injuries almost always respond to direct pressure, and tourniquets are largely unnecessary, and certainly this is one of those. So what did we learn after the Boston bombing? A year later, apparently nothing. I'd like to believe through a mass educational campaign that I helped lead with the Hartford Consensus and the Stop the Bleed campaign. We pushed this out to all of our EMS, and I pushed it out to elementary schools around the state and around the country. And I'd like to think we're doing a lot better now than we were in October, on Halloween, October 2014. And it took 2 years, but finally I got all local EMS to purchase and carry purpose-made tourniquets, and we provided the training for them.
Tonight!
And I'll give you this.
Hey, look, before we begin, I just want to take a moment to talk about the attack in Boston yesterday. Now, obviously, our thoughts and our prayers are with everybody there. And as the president said, we don't know who did this. but they will be found and they will be brought to justice. But whoever did this obviously did not know about the people of Boston. Because nothing these terrorists do is going to shake them. For Pete's sake, Boston was founded by the Pilgrims. A people so tough, they had to buckle their goddamn hats on. It is the cradle of the American Revolution, a city that withstood an 86-year losing streak, a city that made it through the Big Dig, a construction project that backed up traffic for 16 years. I mean, there are commuters just getting home now. Even their bands are tough. It's the hometown of Aerosmith, who in their 5th decade are still going strong. Even Steven Tyler looks fantastic for a 73-year-old woman. But here's what these cowards really don't get. They attacked the Boston Marathon, an event celebrating people who run 26 miles on their day off until their nipples are raw for fun. And they have been holding it in Boston since 1897. And do you know how tough you have to be to run in a whalebone corset? And when those bombs went off, there were runners who, after finishing a marathon, kept running for another 2 miles to the hospital to donate blood. So, here's what I know. These maniacs may have tried to make life bad for the people of Boston, but all they can ever do is show just how good those people are. Now, this is the Colbert Report.
So I don't know that I could ever say it any better than Stephen Colbert, but this is the Boston Museum of Science's take on what is so-called Boston Strong. I can't speak strongly enough about the city's support and the outpouring of support for all the bombing patients, and how this event touched us all and touched the marathon, and sadly changed the way we think about the marathon forever. But I'd also like to believe that it taught us some things about how strong we can be, and how we can conquer adversity, not just in the operating room, but in all the struggles and challenges that life throws at us. So thank you for the opportunity to present, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Dave. I think you left me, and I'm sure many in the audience, speechless about the work that you and your teams have done subsequent to this horrific event, and continue to do in order to improve the system so that we can serve our communities better. I'd like to open it. I know we're a little bit over time, but if anybody has any questions. I'm just going to look here on the chat. I think everybody is really speechless after this. I will, again, I know you so well, and I know that you're so passionate about this work, and will continue to strive for a better and better system. And I think that's what makes this community so special. This is a virtual meeting. Normally we would award you with a plaque and a McGill University tie, and of course the book about Rocke Robertson, and those will be in the mail. And I really would like to thank you for all of your work, all of your efforts in serving our communities, both locally and abroad. So thank you again.
Thank you, Dan. And if any questions develop, you can feel free to share my email. I'm happy to talk about the bombing and disaster preparedness, and answer whatever I can. the whole point here is not to is not to keep the knowledge and experience to ourselves, but to allow it to permeate, our community. That is those of us who are responsible for the care of the injured. So anything I can do to push that information out, happy to do.
Oh, and that's very much appreciated. So thank you. And I know you have a jersey of Brad Marchand.
Yes, I do.
Subsequent, and that's a bit of a point of contention here in Montreal. We will make sure that we will bring you up to Montreal so that we can put a bigger and better jersey of Shea Weber or one of our guys on your wall as well, and we'll bring you up to a hockey game as well. So
it's interesting. I'll just share this with you because it's kind of funny. When I got that, Brad Marchand skated up to me, took the jersey off, and I happened to be with my daughter at the time, who was I think she was 7 at the time. She walked out on the ice with me, and Brad skated up, took his jersey off, and had a Sharpie. And he turns to me and he goes, "Hey Doc, how do you want me to make this out?" And my 7-year-old daughter chimes in and says, "Make it out to Abigail, please." So he did. So now the jersey on my wall says "To Abigail" from Brad. So I guess I owe it to her at some point when she grows up and can appreciate it. I'll have to pass it on. So I'll need a new one to replace it, please.
okay, we'll make sure to address it to Abigail as well.
Yeah, right. Great.
Super. Tarek, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, no, just thanks a lot, Dave. That was fantastic talk. Really appreciate you taking the time to spend this with us. And look, the struggle for preparing people for what they feel to be the unexpected, which unfortunately is not the unexpected, is a constant struggle for all of us. And I always feel, I think much like you have intimated in your talk, that you feel like a run of salmon swimming upstream all the time, trying to get everybody to listen. And then when it happens, then even afterwards, like you, I think very well described, it still doesn't seem to sink in right away, and you have to be that contrary voice and do that somewhat delicately, but enough that it gets people's attention. So we struggle here, I think, even more than you do with getting people to recognize, because we maybe fortunately have fewer events on a regular basis in our communities, but we still have them. We've had some pretty nasty school shootings in Montreal over the years that we've all been involved in.
There's a psychic limitation that I've experienced here, and that is one of the major problems with disaster planning is talking about the possibility of future disasters. No one likes to think about that, right? It's a thing you don't want to have to think about it, because you'd like to believe that we're insulated. And when you say, "Geez, Sandy Hook could happen anywhere," nobody wants to think, "Geez, we're going to have 30 dead children in an elementary school." That is unthinkable, and it's so unpalatable to even talk about. It's a very challenging conversation to have, particularly with non-medical people. I think we tend to think about it in terms of injuries and how to treat injuries and how to have a blood bank. But for non-medical or non-first responders, it's an awful thing to try to wrap your mind around, particularly for politicians and policymakers. It's very, very challenging because the topic is so ugly. And so what I would compel this audience to do is you need to own that torch, man. You need to own it and carry it, because nobody else will. This is very clearly our lane. Nobody else will own this. It is the responsibility of us as trauma doctors to ring this bell and carry this torch. And I think if we all do that in a responsible way, you collectively, me included, can affect the outcome in a positive way for the next event, whatever that will be. And it will come, right? It might not be a terrorist event. It might be, the bus full of hemophiliacs that crash or whatever. But the event, it will come. An event will come that challenges you and challenges your system. And a little bit of preparedness can go a heck of a long way.
I have
Yeah,
a
really
question
well said.
regarding the ambulance training that you did. Was there much of a challenge to get them to agree to carry tourniquets? Probably not after the bombing, but do you think you would have had that same challenge prior to the bombing occurring? Like, how can we from here in Montreal maybe like approach
So
our
I had a
ambulance?
tremendous challenge getting EMS to carry tourniquets after the bombing. It was easy to offer training because I said I'll come train you for free. That was easy. But when you talk about so a tourniquet, right, is whatever, $20 on Amazon or wherever you want to buy it from. So on a per device basis, the cost is insignificant, right? But when you start talking about equipping a system, suddenly that cost becomes dramatic. If you want to give one to every paramedic in a system and then have 2 or 3 on every ambulance, suddenly that starts adding up to many, many thousands of dollars. And so the pushback to me was, well, how are we going to pay for this? And my pushback on that was throw away every liter of crystalloid, quit buying that stuff. It's poison anyway, and buy tourniquets instead. Because I challenge you to show me the patient who was saved by 2 liters of crystalloid in the pre-hospital environment, who could be saved by having a $20 tourniquet. So there are ways to push back on that. Honestly, the major limitation I found was the budget, who's going to pay for it, and who's going to do training and sustainment training. So I own the training lane. That's easy. And where I got real limitations, particularly at schools after Sandy Hook, where I wanted schools to have tourniquets and hemorrhage control kits co-located with their AEDs. I facilitated a philanthropic campaign where
Something happened and you're muted, Dave.
oh geez.
Oh, he's good. I got him. I think it's you, Dan. We got him.
Oh, okay. So I facilitated a
Still
philanthropic campaign where I got tourniquets donated to all the schools in the Boston area. So there are ways to solve this problem, but generally it's a budgetary issue, and I would say there are things on every ambulance that you can throw away and replace with something better. And when you start inventorying what ambulance companies buy every year, it's pretty easy to come up with cost savings for a life-saving device like a simple tourniquet.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Tara is our injury prevention coordinator, so thank you, Tara.
Very good.
Yeah, so definitely implicated in this. Great. Well, thank you again. I mean, really inspiring. I think you can see from the comments, it's extremely, extremely appreciated, you taking the time. And again, I'm quite relieved that you're not in Afghanistan right now or any of those places, and we're available to give this talk. And I look forward to seeing you up here for the Tremblant Marathon and a hockey game.
Yes. Thank you, sir. All right, guys. Have a great day.